They called them ghosts, not because they hid in the shadows, but because every empire felt their touch without ever seeing their faces. Before we go any further, pause for 2 seconds, because this is where you come in. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? And before the story unfolds, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, so this knowledge doesn't stay buried where the powerful want it to stay. All right, let's begin. The story of the Backroom Kings starts in quiet rooms padded with velvet, gold leaf maps, and firelit walls where whispers shaped wars more violently than any cannon. These were not politicians. They were not kings. They were not generals. They were the men kings visited with trembling hands. They were the men generals begged for signatures. They were the men who could, with a single stroke of a pen, determine whether a nation lived or bled. And for nearly 2 centuries, they formed a discreet financial council. No newspaper dared to name, no historian dared to expose while they were still alive. They were the unseen axis of war. What made them terrifying wasn't their wealth, it was their timing. They stepped into the room only when the world began to crack. They waited for political tension, economic tremors, diplomatic failures, and then offered loans so large, so tempting, so essential, that empires would agree to anything. And the moment the ink dried, the war machine roared to life. Those kings knew that when they signed, their armies were no longer theirs. They belonged to the men in the back room. These financiers did not seek ideology. They sought patterns. They studied grain shortages, shipping disruptions, crop failures, border skirmishes, parliament disputes, and the psychological weaknesses of rulers. They predicted chaos the way astronomers predicted eclipses. Their mastery lay not in prophecy, but in pressure. They pushed exactly when nations could not stand on their own weight. They whispered that a rival empire was preparing to strike. They warned that peace would be economic suicide. They reminded rulers that a short, decisive war would rally the nation and stabilize their throne. And when doubt remained, they offered money, more money than a government could imagine, on the condition that the war happened now. By the late 1800s, this secret council had already become a phantom force. Their wealth was stretched across continents, railroads, mines, steelworks, ship construction, insurance networks, diplomatic intelligence, and even private intelligence agents who infiltrated foreign ministries for financial forecasting. Their reach extended into London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, New York, and St. Petersburg. They didn't operate in one room. They operated in 20%, and every room had a different name, a different representative, a different mask. That is why historians later struggled to track them. They were never one organization, but a shifting alliance of families whose interests intersected whenever the world approached a tipping point. Their influence grew most visible, ironically, when governments tried to hide them. In the archives of multiple European powers, historians found minutes of meetings that referenced external guarantors, private treasury backers, neutral financiers, or simply the gentlemen. Those innocuous titles concealed the most aggressive form of influence in modern history. When a country requested funds for rearmament, the backroom kings didn't simply grant it. They demanded collateral in land, mines, ports, or future taxation rights. They didn't just approve loans, they controlled the post-war economy. They didn't merely fund conflict, they fed on its aftermath. But the true power of these men wasn't financial, it was psychological. They understood that fear could be monetized. They understood that a king would do anything to avoid appearing weak. They knew that when 2 nations distrusted each other, all they had to do was quietly finance both sides and let nature take its course. Their strategy was to create a world where peace seemed irresponsible and war seemed inevitable. And the incredible thing is this: ordinary people never knew they existed. Farmers who lost sons in the fields of Europe, mothers who waited by windows for soldiers who never came back, workers who found their wages worthless after inflation. They never saw the faces of the men who engineered the disasters that destroyed their lives. Wars came and went, flags changed, orders shifted, but the backroom kings remained, generation after generation, increasingly invisible and increasingly powerful. By the early 20th century, their influence reached its peak. Entire governments could not sign a treaty, not declare a war, not rebuild a city without receiving their approval. Even presidents who believed they ruled their nations privately confided in diaries that international finance had become a throne above thrones. Some statesmen tried to resist them. Some fought to establish independent national banks, gold reserves, and self-funded militaries. Those attempts always failed, not because of political sabotage, though that happened, but because the backroom kings controlled the world's arteries, credit, debt, and liquidity. Without them, governments simply couldn't breathe. And in the midst of this, one chilling fact remained constant. They never lifted a sword. They never stood on a battlefield. They never fired a shot. Yet the world shook at their decisions. The moment the backroom kings realized their grip on the global war loan machinery could shift the fate of entire nations, they stopped thinking like bankers and started operating like strategists of destiny. Their private meetings no longer revolved around interest rates or national reserves. They revolved around timelines, alliances, and the psychology of monarchs. And as Europe marched toward the age of mass mobilization, their calculations expanded from ledgers to continents. What they wanted now was not merely repayment, it was a position in a world they knew was about to turn volatile. They understood a fundamental truth long before statesmen did. Every empire believes it is eternal, right until the day it comes asking for money. And that is when the backroom kings, always silent, always invisible, took control of the steering wheel. When the Balkan powder keg lit its first sparks, governments across Europe erupted into feverish diplomacy. But inside certain mahogany rooms, behind windows thickened by velvet drapes, the backroom kings watched events not with panic, but with precision. They examined the cascading alliances, the speed of mobilization schedules, the desperation in ambassadors' coded dispatches. They saw the future spreading out before them like a map, and every possible path led to one inevitable conclusion: large-scale conflict. Wars, like markets, have patterns. A rising nationalism here, a miscalculated ultimatum there, a royal ego bruised over the wrong border dispute. These were signals, not surprises, and nowhere did they ring louder than in the books of men who financed armies. But the key to their influence wasn't predicting war, it was timing. They waited until governments were cornered, until budget committees failed, until generals whispered to their ministers that the army could not move without fresh credit. Only then did the backroom kings invite envoys into their private lounges. Not banks, lounges. Because they had learned that when a nation is desperate, formality slows things down. They poured drinks, laid out polished maps, and spoke softly, like men who already knew how the war would end. This calmness unnerved officials far more than explosive negotiations ever could. They were men who never flinched. Men who could reject a desperate empire with the same tone they used to accept a routine mortgage in peacetime. And that more than gold gave them power. Across the Atlantic, the American industrial surge created a new arena for war financing, and the backroom kings extended their reach like lighthouses in a storm. They understood that wars aren't won on battlefields, they're won in factories, foundries, shipping ports. So they built networks across countries, relationships with steel magnates, shipbuilders, oil refiners. The world thought of them as financiers, but by the time the 20th century's storms rolled in, they had become something far greater, the architects of logistical empires. You could line up 1,000 soldiers, but without rifles, boots, food, fuel, they were nothing but a crowd. The backroom kings controlled the flow of everything soldiers needed to remain soldiers. And yet, the most dangerous part of their power wasn't what they controlled, it was what they withheld. When a nation's ambassadors pleaded for an emergency loan and the kings hesitated, even for a day, that hesitation sent fear across entire governments. A minister might call for an emergency parliamentary session. A general might demand that borders be reinforced. A king might interpret the delay as a sign of betrayal by his allies. This was the unspoken authority the backroom kings possessed. The ability to cause panic simply by pausing their pen over a contract. They didn't need to declare anything. Nations read meaning in their silence. During World War I, their influence reached a level even they had not anticipated. Suddenly, they were no longer merely responding to wars. They were shaping the framework of international survival. They knew exactly which states would collapse from debt pressure, which armies would break under supply shortages, which alliances would buckle because someone, somewhere, ran out of credit. They had numbers, cold, precise, merciless numbers. And numbers do not lie. Diplomats lead, generals lied, politicians lead. But the ledgers, sitting inside their vaults, told the truth long before the newspapers did. Yet even with such unrivaled power, They were experts at invisibility. Their names rarely appeared in the press. Their families avoided public scandals. Their offices were discreet, their correspondence coded, their influence channeled through layers of intermediaries. This secrecy wasn't just a tactic, it was a shield. Because they understood that the moment the public realized how wars were truly financed, revolutions would erupt not against kings or parliaments, but against the people who held the purse strings of the world. So they built their empire on anonymity. The fewer people who understood their system, the longer the system would last. But history is not static. After the greatest conflict humanity had ever seen, the geopolitical landscape began to mutate. Empires fell, new states emerged, and international institutions attempted to regulate the machinery of global finance. For the first time, the backroom kings faced a shifting terrain they hadn't fully anticipated. Their strategies had always relied on the predictability of nations. But now, ideologies rose that rejected the old financial order entirely. War was no longer just an opportunity. It was a recalibration. They adapted, of course. They always adapted. Yet the world could feel a faint tremor beneath the surface, as if the old pillars of invisible power were beginning to lean ever so slightly. Still, even as governments nationalized industries, even as central banks gained authority, even as new oversight mechanisms appeared, the backroom kings continued to operate in the shadows, reduced in visibility, but not in influence, because the most important truth they had mastered was eternal. Nations will always need money faster than they can raise it. And as long as that truth holds, there will always be back rooms, velvet drapes, polished maps, and men who control the fate of wars without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Their legacy is not written in textbooks. It is written in interest rates attached to forgotten war bonds, in debt agreements filed under obsolete ministries, in secret ledgers locked inside archives no historian has fully accessed. And somewhere in the dim corners of financial history, echoes remain of men who shaped the bloodiest centuries, not through armies or speeches, but through the quiet precision of a signature written at the right moment in the right room, witnessed by no one but the desperate envoy of an empire racing against time.